Hi, this is Matt Burns from the University of Missouri, and we're here today to have another conversation about the science of reading, and highlighting some research and some high quality articles. And I found a great one this time. With us today is Dr. Theresa Roberts, and Dr. Roberts she described herself as semi-retired from the Oregon Research Institute, who now still engaged in reading research because this is a passion of hers and something she loves. Worked for many years at the California State University in Sacramento, uh, and has her a degree from UCLA in child development. Dr. Roberts, Theresa, thank you for coming. I want to share the article real briefly so people can see it. The article we're going to be talking about is preschool instruction, letter names and sounds. Does contextualized or decontextualized instruction matter? And this was published in a recent Reading Research Quarterly. You can see the website up here at the top, and you can find it that way. But honestly, I found it just simply Googling it was not difficult to find at all. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. All right, so Dr. Roberts, let's start with just a couple of questions to kind of summarize it. First of all, I recognize that it looks like you compared two conditions. Can you please describe what those two conditions were?
Yes, well, we compared, the focus was learning of alphabet letter names and letter sounds. And the two conditions that we had was in one condition, we looked at learning when children participated in decontextualized instruction, which to us meant that we taught them showing letters isolated on single cards. We had them doing activities with individual single letters. The focus was on promoting memory for those paired associations. We had a variety of games and activities to do that. In the other treatment, the contextualized treatment, we taught the exact same letter content in the exact same letter by the same group of randomized teachers for the same amount of time at the same times of the day. But in this case, we taught those letters contextualized within children's storybooks, within children's names, and within words that came from the storybooks.
Fantastic, great. And so, what did you find? Which one's more effective?
Well, and we measured several different alphabet outcomes. We measured both accuracy of letter name and letter sound learning, and we also uniquely measured speed of letter name and letter sound learning. We measured phonemic awareness because of the relationship between alphabet knowledge and phonemic awareness. And again, I would like to emphasize that measure was at the level of children being able to identify the initial sounds in words. It was not rhyming, compound words. It was a phoneme level task. We measured language also under the presumption that possibly that in the contextualized treatment, when you were using storybooks and talking about children's names, that we might get a boost to language that would not be present when we taught the letters just in isolation. And what we found, and we also measured engagement. And for us, what engagement meant was we watched children during instruction in small groups, and observers rated the amount of attention, participation, and the what they saw with respect to children's affect, whether they were positive, negative, etc. with that. And during each lesson, each child we sort of did what we call sweeps. We'd watch a child, record, move to the next child, record. And over the course of these 10 to 12 minute lessons, we could get at least 3 to 4 observations of each child completed. So that was so it was actual engagement during instruction of the alphabet content that we were testing. And what we found was, which might be surprising to some, was that actually children that received the decontextualized treatment, where we focused on the individual letters, where we focused a great deal on just pairing the letter form and its letter name or letter sound, that children in that condition had statistically significantly greater letter sound learning and statistically significantly greater ability to say the first sounds in whole words, and statistically significantly greater levels of engagement.
That's so fascinating. Now, you said this would surprise some people. Um,
Yes.
is this a new finding in the literature? Is this just a real?
Well, the previous literature on alphabet instruction is really very, very lean. Uh, a handful of randomized controlled trials, that meet sort of the experimental science of reading standards that, we were looking at. And in those studies, typically letter names are measured more often than letter sounds. Theories of the learning process involved in learning letters were largely missing. The results are mixed. So there had been really very little research. And we began all this with the very simple conjecture that instruction should logically match the way children learn a particular content. And from that, we reasoned that this isolated context and a lot of practice on forming strong memories for the names of the letters, the names and sounds of the letters, was actually likely to be beneficial. So we had a number of studies with that. However, in early childhood, there is a strong emphasis on the importance of language, which I share. But with respect to letters, there's also a fairly strongly held belief that children will learn letters best when they are encountered uh, in the context of meaningful language, like storybooks, when the letters are encountered, when they're interested, like in their names, uh, and when those letters are looked at, in whole real words. And there's quite a strong feeling about that. And so we thought after we did our initial science looking at ways to teach the letters that we would compare these two different formats of instruction. We did our best, as I identified a little bit for you, to make those two formats as similar as possible, both with respect to who was taught, who was teaching, what was taught, how long it lasted. And we even went so far as to try to match the number of times the teacher would refer to a name or sound. Now, we couldn't control children's responses within that, but anyway. And so
Wow.
that's what we found.
Wow, that's really great. So, and I'll tell you, I was very impressed by the methods. I don't have time to really get into it in too much detail, but you measured affect. This is 127 preschoolers.
Right.
Engagement, 120, and that's a great deal of work to get that done. So that was awesome.
And we
Uh,
measured it at 3 points over the course of the intervention. In
wow.
the first week, because we said, okay, but we might be getting Hawthorne effects, or the opposite, because kids didn't know what the heck was going on. And then we measured it in the middle of the intervention, and we measured it again at the end of the intervention. We had a total of, in the end, of 85 children that we could get all of those sweeps done for. In
Wow.
preschool, you do have a higher rate of absenteeism because, it's
Right.
kids
Exactly.
come and go on a more as
So
they
it's
will.
great, exactly. Really great methodology. I was very impressed. Tell me one thing though, because it's the science of reading. What's one limitation to your study that your readers
Well, for
should?
me personally, just to point out in general, we don't know the relationship of this particular instruction and the learning that children achieved to how it's going to relate to when they actually learn how to read. So we don't have those longitudinal measures. Um, but for me personally, the biggest limitation was that we found a substantial number of children who made little progress. So while we had on our averages, what we call in the field, fair, moderate to large effect sizes on these differences, we still had some across all four of these studies, some 20 to 30% of kids who made very little progress. And so I started doing a lot of snooping around, just trying to, in the data, trying to figure out who were these kids? What identified them as being different from kids who made good progress? Now, we had in these studies 3 and 4-year-old children. We had about 40% dual language learners, which none of the previous studies on alphabet learning had disaggregated their data by. None of them were able to look at the effects of the interventions on that particular group. So I looked at 3 and 4-year. I took all the kids who made low progress and I looked at them compared to kids that made, and low progress I define is they learned fewer than 25% of the letters that were taught. And it wasn't 3-year-olds. It wasn't dual language learners that comprised that group. It wasn't even entry-level knowledge that comprised that group. And I'm just looking at, correlations, but the one thing that I did find was that in kids who made little progress, there was a significant correlation for those children between growth and number of lessons they attended. For kids that made, moderate to strong growth, there was not a significant relationship with how many lessons they attended. But for those at-risk children that wound up making little progress, that was the one thing that I could find. Plus, they were lower, and it won't be a surprise to any of you listening, they were lower in oral language proficiency. Now, this did not mean necessarily just because they were dual language learners, because there's some overlap. We had some kids who spoke English as the first language and the only language they spoke in the home, and they still had low English language scores.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. So I know I'm going to show the article one more time as we wrap up here. You mentioned another article coming out in the special issue on Reading Research Quarterly.
Yes, Reading Research Quarterly. They've already published the first issue, a special issue on articles looking at the science of reading. And what I hope is on my last revision of an article that I believe is going to come out. And that article is on learning letters, evidence and questions from a science of reading perspective. And in that article, I summarized this whole suite of 4 studies on alphabet learning, and with a strong goal of wanting to speak directly to teachers, policymakers, leaders in early childhood for the instructional implications of the studies. And I would like to emphasize that in these studies, one of the things, the implications are pretty strong, because all of these studies had randomized controlled trials with carefully matched. We didn't just look to say what happens when we teach with our experimental stuff to if children get no teaching at all. So we compare them to closely matched other treatments. So in this article, I summarize and point out what those teaching implications are that I believe with a fair level of confidence, teachers could implement in preschool classrooms with the understanding that those practices are going to promote children's alphabet learning.
Wow, fantastic. I look forward to seeing that. May have to have you back on.
Okay, I'll be here.
Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.